Hello everyone, I'm Celine from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to video 2 for the Salvia Supply Stand. We're going to do the assembly of our stand in this video. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew on our Velcro pieces to the full body exterior piece and the interior section A lining piece. So if you look at the pattern pieces, and these are versions of the pattern pieces that I printed out earlier, you might see some additional measurements and little circles at the corner of the Velcro placement boxes. Those are things that I've decided to add just to make things a little bit clearer for everyone. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the pattern pieces and we're going to punch out a hole at the four corners of these Velcro placement boxes, and that's just so that we can transfer marks to our fabric to show us where the Velcro needs to be sewn onto the pieces. Now, if you have a hole punch, that would be probably work a lot better than the method that I'm using, but my hole punch is in my sewing space and I'm not going to get it, so I'm just improvising. Okay, so the four corners, I have a little hole punched out, and I'm going to do the same for this pattern piece. And you'll want to get a fabric pen, so preferably one that will disappear with heat or something like that. Okay. Now, the interior section A piece, if you'll remember in the last video, we put in some pieces of heavyweight interfacing along these two sections. So since we're going to be sewing Velcro pieces here, this heavyweight interfacing is perfect to stabilize the area where we're sewing on Velcro. However, for this full body piece, we don't have that. What I would like to do first, before we sew on the Velcro, is to reinforce the area where we're sewing on the Velcro pieces, just to make sure that our Velcro will not tear out of the fabric when we're opening and closing the stand. So I'm just marking, and this doesn't have to be perfect, I just want to know approximately where we're going to be installing the Velcro. And I'm going to grab some scraps of my heavyweight interfacing, so the same one that we used here. If you remember when we were cutting out, there was a leftover piece, so we're just going to cut out some small pieces that we can fuse over top these marks. Okay, so we have our two scraps of interfacing here. Now we're going to turn this over, and I need to make those marks where I'm going to install the Velcro, but this time on the right side of the fabric, not on the wrong side, because we're sewing the Velcro on the right side, obviously. And this is a fabric pen, so it will disappear when there's any heat applied to it. Okay, and then for this piece here, I made the Velcro a different size on the different pieces because I don't want it to show when the stand is closed. So on this full body piece, I'll show you, they are 2 inches long. And then on the interior section A, they are 1.5 inches long. I also have selected whether I have the hook or the loop tape on different pieces for different reasons. On the flap, which is here, I prefer to have the loop part, and then on the body I prefer to have the hook part. So on this part here I'm putting the hook tape. So that's the tape that feels rough, and then the loop tape is the part that is softer. So I want these to be 2 inches. And don't worry if they're a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, that's not a big deal. There'll be a little bit extra. Okay, so we want to sew these here and here. I'm just going to lift the pattern piece off. And it's probably going to be difficult for you to see the dots on the video, but I can see them. So I'm going to, you can use a bit of glue, you can pin them in place. I like using a tiny bit of double-sided tape just to hold them in place for sewing. And I make sure that I don't put any of the tape where I'm going to be sewing because I don't want my needle to get gummed up. And do the same for the second piece. And then I'm just going to sew it in place all the way around. Don't sew too close to the edge because then you risk tearing the tape when you're opening and closing the stand. Along the edges especially, I find this has a tendency to come apart. So I like to sew just where this tape portion meets the hooks. Okay, so I'm going to use white thread because I don't want the stitching to show. And I'm just going to sew all the way around both of them, making sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end. So I sewed the 2 Velcro pieces on the full body exterior, and then I went ahead and I did the same thing for the interior section A lining piece. I transferred the marks for the 4 corners of the Velcro placement. Then I cut the loop part of the Velcro 1.5 inch long pieces. Used some double-sided tape, stuck them down to the fabric, and then sewed them to the fabric all the way around. Okay, so we're going to now sew up the vinyl pouches. You're going to need the 2 pouch binding pieces, your 2 zippers, your 2 vinyl pieces, your 4 pouch body pieces, your vinyl binding piece, and your zipper upper section. So to press the vinyl binding pieces, you're going to press them like you would any double fold binding. So fold it in half, wrong sides together, and press along the entire length. I'm going to do the same for this. I'm doing both at the same time. Then open up the binding piece and fold in each half towards that center crease and press again. turn on a bit of steam. Okay, so you're doing both halves in towards the center. And then fold in half again along that original crease and press. Okay, that's what it should look like. And then I'll do the same and finish the second piece. So I'm going to set aside all of the pieces for one pouch and just show you how to sew up the first pouch. So you're going to open up the piece of binding and insert one of the longer edges of your vinyl inside so that it reaches all the way inside to the crease, and then just hold that in place with clips. Don't use pins when you're using vinyl because the holes that the pins will make will be permanent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the binding piece to the vinyl just along this bottom edge here. I would say even less than 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the bottom edge of the binding. This is what it looks like from the back. Now, depending on the vinyl that you're using, some of them are really sticky. So what I like to do when I'm sewing this part is to just slightly lift the vinyl away from the bed of the machine so it doesn't get stuck to the bed of the machine. So now you're going to need one of your 10-inch zippers, and you're going to place this along the zipper. Now this is a bit tricky because I don't like to use pins in this step because I don't like to put pins through the vinyl. So it doesn't really matter in this section since you won't be seeing it. So if you do want to pin it, you can. But what I just do is place it and then bring it over to the machine, kind of like this. Now, when you're sewing here, you want to make sure that you keep the same amount of zipper tape visible. So you don't want to sew this on crooked. You want it to be nice and straight with an equal amount of space between the top of the binding and the edge of the zipper coil, and you want to make sure that it's the same the entire length. So when you're sewing, you'll want to push your zipper pull out of the way and not sew beside the zipper pull because it does push the zipper tape out of the way, and then your binding will end up being crooked. So keep it away from where you're starting and place it. I like to, there's a kind of like lines on the zipper tape, so I pick a line and then I follow, but I try to keep about 1/4 inch of space here. Okay, so now that we've attached the binding to the zipper, we're going to take one of our zipper upper section pieces and we're going to flip it so it's wrong side facing up, and we're going to clip it to the other edge of our zipper and make sure that the sides here of this zipper upper section is lined up with the sides of the vinyl window. And clip this together. Now, when we're sewing this piece to the zipper, we're going to move our zipper pull out of the way. I'm going to start sewing over here, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. So now I'm just going to sew all the way across here with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. So the zipper upper section is sewn to the zipper. I'm just going to press that away from the zipper. And now I'm going to top stitch that seam allowance with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the zipper. Okay, so that's what it looks like so far. Now we're going to take our pouch body pieces. So I want one piece that's going to be behind the window and one piece that's going to be the back of the pouch. And you're going to place these so that they are wrong sides together. I have a little mark from my clip, so I'm going to press that out. Okay, and we're just going to quickly baste these two pieces together with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around. Okay, so these pieces, our pouch body pieces, are basted together. Now we're going to place this over top. And what I do is I align the bottom edge of my vinyl with the bottom edge of the pouch body pieces. Now, if you use a number 3 zipper, uh, the zipper upper, what did I call it? The zipper upper section. It might be placed a little differently. So there is a lot of variation that can occur here. And so what I did to compensate for that is in a little bit later, I'm going to be getting you to insert this into a seam 1/2 inch above the seam. So that should take care of any variation. So don't worry if everything isn't lining up perfectly. That is fine. I've made some accommodations for that a little bit later on. So now what I'm going to do again is I'm going to do a quick basting stitch all the way around. Now, if you don't have a Teflon foot or a walking foot, you're going to want to sew with the back of your pouch facing up so that your feed dogs can grab the vinyl. Sometimes it still has trouble grabbing the vinyl. So it really is better if you can have a walking foot or a Teflon foot to use. Mine works quite well over vinyl and tends to not stick. If you don't have any of those things, you can just put a piece of tissue paper over top your vinyl and then just tear it away when you're done. So they're very thin tissue paper. So now I'm just going to do again a basting stitch all the way around. I'm just going to trim it so that I can square it off a little bit. It's a little bit crooked. My machine had a little tantrum while I was basting just now, so everything went a little bit wacky. So I'm just going to trim it so that I have a nice rectangle shape. Okay, so that's what that looks like now. I'm just going to put that aside, and we're going to press our pouch binding piece, which I intended to do earlier, but I forgot. So all we're going to do to prepare this piece is just fold it in half, wrong sides together, along the entire length, and press. So when you're sewing on the binding, I think it's going to be easier if I just show you at the machine as I'm sewing. So there's no pinning or clipping or anything like that. You just place the binding and sew it on. So I'm going to place the one end here at the top right corner, and I'm going to start with a back stitch, and then using 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to attach the binding to the edge here. Now, if you've ever done binding on a quilt, this is probably a technique that is familiar to you. I know there's a lot of different ways that everyone likes to do binding for a quilt. So this is just the method that I selected for this pattern. Okay, so I'm starting at the top right corner with my binding piece and aligning the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the pouch. And I start here and I back stitch. I should probably use a bigger stitch length. Okay, and then I sew down until I get to 1/4 inch away from this bottom corner. And then when I get 1/4 inch away from the bottom corner, I stop and I back stitch again. Okay, so cut your thread. Then you're going to fold the binding piece so that it is facing up away from the pouch. And you want the raw edge of the binding to be aligned up with the bottom raw edge of the pouch. Then you're going to fold it down towards you like this so that the raw edges again here are aligned, and you have a folded edge at the corner here, the top of the corner. Then you're going to start sewing again, making sure to backstitch. I have a pesky little thread here got in the way. Okay, and then do the same again. You're going to sew the binding all the way down to the opposite corner with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm getting close to the corner. I'm going to stop 1/4 inch away and backstitch. Then cut my thread. And then I'm doing exactly the same thing. So point this all the way facing up with the raw edges aligned, and then fold it down towards you so that there is a folded edge at the top and these raw edges are aligned again. Start with a back stitch and then sew all the way to the top. When you get to the top left corner, make sure that you back stitch. Okay, I'm going to trim this excess binding piece. Okay, now we're going to start flipping the binding towards the wrong side of the pouch, just like this. So you're wrapping it around the raw edges and use clips to hold that in place. Now when we get to the corner, you're going to flip the pouch around so you're looking at the corner. And then you flip one side like this. So you want it to have an angled corner like this. And then you're going to fold that angled corner down. And you want to try to place it so that you have a nice mitered angle. It's a little bit difficult to show you this, but like this. I don't know if you can see that. And then you finish folding the rest until you get to the other corner. So I'm going to fix my clip here. This is a tiny detailed part and a little bit difficult to show on camera. So there you go. Does that look any clearer? Hopefully you can see that. And then you're going to do the same thing to miter this corner at this end. Like this. Use a clip to hold it in place. And then finish the rest. Now to sew the binding down, you're going to flip the pouch over so you're looking at the right side of the pouch. And you can either stitch in the ditch, so that's sewing right in that, basically where the binding meets the pouch, right in that gap, or you can just use a very small seam allowance on the inside edge of the binding. So when you're rotating at the corner, you're rotating right where you have the little mitered folded edge. Okay, and I can just trim the excess binding, and this one is done. Okay, now the two pouches are done. You're going to need the pouches, both of your interior section B pieces, and your interior section C piece. What we're going to do to start is we're going to mark all of our centers. So I want the center at the top edge of the pouches on the right side. I don't want to fold them in half, so I'm going to use a ruler to find the center. Now yours might be a little bigger or smaller, depends on how precise you were with seam allowances and everything, so don't worry if they're a little bit different than mine. Okay, so they're 9.5 inches wide, which means the center is 4.75. Do the same for the second one. Okay, now I'm using my fabric pen for that. So they should all be 11 inches wide. So the center is 5.5. I see I wasn't very good with my cutting, and mine are slightly wider. Okay, now that I fixed that problem, 5.5 is the center. So you just need the top center mark on the interior section C on the right side. So if you're using a directional print, you're going to need marks in different places. Just to keep it simple, I'm just going to mark my centers, top and bottom, right side and wrong side. Okay, so now you're going to need the interior section C piece and have that right side facing up. You want that center mark at the top, and then take one of the pouches, line up the center marks, and then I want you to bring it 1/2 inch up. So I'm using I should probably follow these lines properly if I'm going to use them. So I'm just aligning the top edge with one of the lines on my cutting mat. And then I'm just going to align the center marks, but then bring this up 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to base that in place. Now it's important that you bring it up 1/2 inch because you don't want to be too low to the bottom edge, because then it'll be very difficult when you're sewing your stand together in the final step. So I'm just going to quickly base this in place. Okay, now make sure when so in all of these, the next few steps, I find there is a tendency for the pieces to shift, even if you've pinned or clipped them in place. So you want to always verify the amount of space here on either side, that it's even. And I can see that mine is not, so it must have moved a little bit. It's okay if it moves a little bit, but it shouldn't move more than your seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch, because, and really to be safe, not more than 1/4 inch. Okay, so now we're going to attach one of our interior section B pieces. And if you remember when we did the heavyweight interfacing on the wrong side, we left a gap along the sides and along one longer edge. So this longer edge without the heavyweight interfacing, that's what I want to attach in this step. And this is why we did not have the interfacing go all the way to this side here, because it would be way too bulky in the seam, and we want to avoid that. My zipper pull is going to be in the way a little bit, so I'm going to move that to the center. You're probably going to need to move that zipper pull out of the way as you're working. Okay, now I'm going to sew this in place all the way across with your typical seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so we've sewn this seam, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end, and now we're just going to press that away from the pouch. And now we're going to top stitch the seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to take the second pouch, and when I pressed, I erased my center mark. So I'm going to put it back. Okay, so again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to use the lines on my mat. Put this along the top edge. And then place this. So my top edge here is a little bit crooked. I should have straightened it a little, but it doesn't matter if it's a little bit off of 1/2 inch, as long as it's fairly close. Okay, and then again, I'm going to use clips to hold that in place. Okay. I think I might actually move it over because it seems to push it over when I'm sewing. Okay, and then I'm just going to quickly base this in place along the top. Okay, and then we're going to take the last piece of interior section B. And again, the space at the bottom here where there is no interfacing, that's what we want to have at the top here. So again, making sure that these center marks are lined up. Okay, and then we're going to sew in place with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from this edge, not from this edge, from the edge of the interior section B piece, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. All right, and then again, we're going to press this away from the pouch and then top stitch our seam allowance. Okay, so now you're going to need interior section A, and we're going to sew this bottom straight edge to this top straight edge here. Now, because of course, if you'll see, I kind of sewed these a little bit skewed. It seems to happen no matter what. It's not a big deal as long as it's not too much. So you're just going to place this. And what I like to do is I like to align the sides of this with this bottom portion here, which is our interior section C. So I like to make sure that those are aligned. Okay, and then clip these together. And then sew them together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now when you sew this together, make sure that you're back stitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, so these are sewn together now, and I'm going to flip this and press the seam allowance towards this portion here, the interior section A. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this seam allowance. Okay. So you're going to use the seam here, so not the line of top stitching, but the actual seam as your starting line, and you're going to measure 3 inches up from that line.
Your first line 3 inches above the seam, and then a second line 3 inches above the first.
So I went ahead and sewed one of the elastic pieces to the lining piece, and I just wanted to do this so that you could visualize how it's going to look when we are done. And now we're going to do the same thing that I just did for this elastic with the second piece of elastic and the other line that we drew to the lining fabric. So we're going to follow the instructions that are in the pattern, and starting from left to right, you're going to make the following marks along that line that we just drew. You're going to make 3 marks that are 1 inch apart. So there's 1 inch of space and then a mark, 1 inch, a space, 1 inch, a space. Then we're going to make 6 marks that are 1/2 an inch apart. So between each of these marks, you're going to measure 1/2 an inch and then make a mark. And then we're going to do 4 marks that are 1 inch apart, and then we should be left with a 1 inch section. So the 1 inch at the beginning and the end, that's important. So even if you customize your own elastic placements, you always want to start with an inch and end with an inch, because that's going to be within the seam allowance, and you want the elastic to go all the way to the edges so that it's caught in that seam. Now we're going to make marks on our elastic. Again, we're going to follow the placements that are mentioned in the pattern. So starting from left to right again, we're going to make a mark at 1 inch. So don't forget that the elastic is a bit longer than what we might need. And I did that just in case you wanted to customize your measurements. However, if you customize them quite a lot, you might end up needing a lot more or a lot less elastic. So following the pattern, we're making 2 marks that are 1 inch apart. So 1 inch and then a mark, 1 inch and then a mark. Then we're going to make 1 mark that is 1.5 inch from this mark. So there's 1.5 inches. Okay. Now from this mark, we're going to make 6 marks that are 1 inch apart. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oops, that moved on me a little bit, and 6. And then after these marks, we're going to make 3 marks that are 1.5 inches apart. So the bigger the elastic, the amount of space between the elastics, the bigger the loop is going to be. So right now we're doing these 3 loops that are 1.5 inches. 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to end with 2 marks that are 1 inch apart. 1, 2, and then we're going to leave the remainder. It's going to be just in that 1 inch portion, a little bit extra. We're going to trim that. So now we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to sew the elastic to the fabric. And to do that, I'm going to actually flip it this way so that we're just following the marks that we made in the order that we made them. Okay, so we're sewing the raw edge of the elastic to the raw edge of the fabric with the elastic centered over top of the line that we drew. And we're just going to do a quick stitch to hold that in place. And then what you're going to do the entire length is match the mark on the elastic to the mark on the fabric and sew it in place. You're going to go across back and forth a few times just to make sure that your elastics don't come loose. And then you'll see that there's some areas where the space between the marks on the elastic are wider than the space between the marks on the fabric. And that's what we want to create these loops here. Okay, so we have our 2 rows of elastic in place. If you have any excess elastic, you can just trim that off. And if you have a thread cutter like me, you probably have a million little threads you want to trim off. And just make sure that your elastic loops are matching top and bottom. So we're very nearly done. All we're going to do now is the final assembly and insert all of our firm sew-in interfacing so that we give the stand a lot of structure. Okay. Okay, so now we're putting our assembled lining and our exteriors together, right sides together. Now that we have the exterior and the lining layers clipped together, right sides together, we are going to obviously need to turn this when we've sewn all the way around. So we're going to leave an opening at the bottom straight edge. I've drawn 2 lines here along the bottom edge that are both of them 2 inches in from each of the bottom corners. They're also 3/8 of an inch high, which is our seam allowance. So before we start sewing all the way around, we're going to start at one of the blue marks. You can pick whichever one you're most comfortable with. And you're going to start at the bottom of the line, and sew up towards the top of the line. Make sure that you backstitch a couple of times here at the beginning. Then when you get to the top of the line, you're going to stop and rotate, and you're going to start sewing all the way around. Then when you get to the second blue line, you're going to obviously be stopping at the top of the blue line here. You're going to stop and rotate down towards the outer edge, and you're going to backstitch a couple of times again. Okay, so we've sewn all the way around. Now we're going to trim a bit in the seam allowance. And at these corners here, you're going to do one angled cut, and you're going to try to cut into that corner, but don't cut any of the stitches. That's very important. So do that on both of these. And then we're going to trim away at the corners like this. Don't cut too close to the stitches at the corner, otherwise when you're poking the corners out, you'll go through the corners and possibly tear them. Okay, so now that the seam allowance has been trimmed all the way around, we can turn it around so that it is right side out. Okay, so now that it's turned, we're going to want to poke out our corners. I'm just using this metal chopstick to do that. And reach in there and poke out the flap. Now, one thing that I did forget to do, which I realize now, is to mark the location of our lines. But if you're like me and you've also forgotten and didn't read the pattern, I have a solution. Okay, so now we're going to press all the seams nice and flat. And we're also going to press this opening shut, but we're going to do that just a little bit later. It's not super important to do that right now because we're going to be inserting our firm interfacing in here. Okay, so now that the stand is turned right side out, we're just going to press the seams. Now, I really wish that my ironing board was a little bit bigger, but this is what I have for filming. So I'm just going to take my time and make sure that the seams are out all the way. So I like to sort of roll them so that I know that they're out all the way. Make sure that you don't iron your Velcro pieces, they will melt. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do now is add our pieces of firm sew and interfacing. So we're going to start with the flap firm interfacing piece, and you're going to, through the opening at the bottom, you're going to insert that, and you want the rounded corners to match the rounded corners at the top. So you're going to stick that all the way inside. And make sure that you insert it all the way to the top. So you want it to reach all the way to the top here. Really make sure that it's nicely tucked in there. And you also want to make sure that it's nice and straight here. So I was supposed to get you to transfer the marks from the full body pattern piece to the lining here. Since I forgot to do that, what I've done is I've measured the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then if you place this over top, so cover the line that you just drew, and then mark here and here. This is where we're going to sew across to separate the flap firm interfacing piece that we just inserted from the rest. And you're going to sew all the way across, but stop just before you get to the edge, and then stop and rotate, and then top stitch the flap, and that's going to hold the firm interfacing piece in place inside the flap. And then when you get back to the first mark here, just stop, rotate, and then do a little back stitch. While we have the pattern piece in place, we're also just going to mark the other two lines. Now this one here, if you've done it correctly, and I see mine's a little bit crooked, but your this dividing line here, the section dividing line, it should fall approximately right where you have your seam here. So we don't need to mark that one because we're going to just treat the seam here as that dividing line. Okay, so there's the flap firm interfacing piece stitched in. Now you're going to need the base firm interfacing, and you're doing the same thing. You're going to stick it in between the layers and make sure that you get it right up to this line of stitching. Okay, now that the base firm interfacing is in place, I'm going to go from this mark to this mark and sew across, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so hopefully you can see now we have the flap stitching in, and we have the base dividing line in, and our base firm interfacing is in there. So now you're going to take one of the sandwiches that we created. This is the one that has the craft sticks inside. And in order to get it in there, obviously it's not going to fit through the opening at the bottom. So you're just going to roll it like this and then put it in. And then once you get it inside, you unroll it and make sure that it's all the way in there. So it has to sit between this line and the line that we're just about to sew, which is going to be right in this seam here. So there is quite a lot of room. You should definitely not be sewing over the firm interfacing at all. There's plenty of room for this piece in this section. So now I'm just going to stitch in the ditch. So right in that seam, I'm going to sew from one end to the other, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, and the last thing that we're going to do is add the second sandwich, as I like to call it, inside and unroll it. This one is a little bit more snug, but it does fit. Okay, and then I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to the bottom folded edges. So I did fold them inwards and press them. And you want to try to make sure that the folded edges line up as nicely as possible. And then we're going to sew across the bottom. So I like to sew as close as I can get to that those folded edges along the bottom. So at the same time, you're closing that opening. Okay, now the stand is all done. And to close it, it's like this. And then when you want to open it and use it as a stand, you just turn it the other way, flip your flaps so that your Velcro pieces meet. And there you go. So the location of the fold up here is that seam where we stitched. Your stand is all done. I hope that you enjoyed the video.